Like to give a warm welcome to the first speaker of the today panel, Leonie Suess. She's a research associate at the Zurich University of Arts, and she will speak about her master thesis she wrote about colonial heritage at the Museum of Natural History in Berne. Please, we are all very much looking forward to your presentation. Leonie.
Yes, so hello to everyone from my side. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to be part of this conference and Esther Tisa for this introduction. And of course, I would also like to welcome all those interested people out there who are joining this presentation here online. Now, let me share my screen with you. So, with my contribution, I would like to invite you for a re-envisioning of the displays in natural history museums and what they tell us about nature, and in this case, colonial heritage, if we activate them as historical artifacts and sources. I'm going to talk to you about my research interest, Natural History Museum of Berne and its East Africa expedition, the challenges of the African diorama exhibition, and nature objects as artifacts. The starting point for my research was my long-time interest in dioramas and taxidermy techniques as a way of creating realistic-looking fictional nature. As a matter of fact, similar to many other children growing up in Berne, one of our first school trips was to the African diorama exhibition in Berne. The displays fascinated me back then and were responsible for the first vivid pictures of Africa in my mind. The elaborately crafted scene captured my imagination, whilst at the same time triggered a certain uneasiness. During my recently completed master's in curatorial studies, we frequently focused on the politics of displays in the museums. Our attention was drawn to how museums, as places of representation, construct narratives and create spatial arrangements which shape the way the subject, a spectator, and the exhibited object relate to each other. From a museological point of view, I became interested in dioramas as displays as a part of a wider knowledge production and distribution on the unknown and exotic. According to Karen Wonders, habitat dioramas are museum exhibits that replicate nature-wildlife scenes. Typically, they contain mounted zoological specimens arranged in a recreated copy of their biological surroundings. Ideally, they create an illusion of atmospheric space and distance. So, since dioramas give the illusion of nature frozen in time, how obvious is it to the observer that he or she is actually looking at fiction, a closed historical construction? Which perspectives are revealed and which are obscured? Which narratives do they represent, for example, of colonized regions, and how is this contextualized? So with my master's thesis, I analyzed the narratives of nature and Africa in the permanent diorama exhibition Animals of Africa, Gorillas, Lions and Co. at the Natural History Museum of Berne with a critical approach to representation and provenance. It is on this work which my talk today is based. So the Natural History Museum of Berne was officially founded in 1832 and is today part of the Burgergemeinde of Berne. It is a popular destination for biology and drawing classes, tourists and families with children. It is visited by about 130,000 people yearly. Aside from temporary exhibitions that convey scientific knowledge through texts, objects, maps and graphics, the museum is famous for its more than 200 life-size dioramas depicting preserved animals from Africa, Switzerland and the Northern Hemisphere. First opened in 1936, the exhibition Animals of Africa, Gorillas, Lions and Co. presents until this day specimens of African animal species in their natural habitat. Most of the specimens shown in these dioramas originated from a hunting expedition by the London-based Bernese game hunter Berne de Watteville and his daughter Vivienne de Watteville. They were commissioned by the museum to hunt the animals mainly in the British colonially ruled regions of Kenya and Uganda between 1923 and 1924. Through annual reports and protocols, a lot is known about the safari and the collection. The Wattevilles had a hunting pass that defined the number of animals that could be shot, and they received support from the British colonial authorities where necessary permits for hunting were still lacking, and one time even the museum became directly involved in order to obtain a hunting license from the Belgian authorities, which was rejected. After Berne de Watteville died during the hunt for the 19th lion, his 23-year-old daughter Vivienne de Watteville successfully completed the expedition for the museum and donated their collection of mammal species from Eastern and Central Africa to the institution. According to the 1924 annual report, the director at the time, Franz Baumann, compared the richness and excellent state of collected specimens to the results of the American, English, Swedish, and German expeditions of recent years. This illustrates how highly Baumann valued the trophy collection as a research achievement for the museum. One can also see how international scientific research relied on the hunting of big game at the time, both in nations with colonies and others using colonial institutions and infrastructures for the scientific purposes, so as Switzerland and Sweden. Aside records from the institution, I would like to mention Vivienne de Watteville's first travel narrative. Out in the Blue, published in 1927, received attention as a narrative by a female adventurer and served as template for later fiction. Parts of the text and some of her photographies documenting the safari are on display in the exhibition. Despite critical concerns about the genre of travel writing as a source, along with her attitudes to race, gender, and class at this point, I would like to mention that her report still gives an interesting insight into an upper-class white perspective regarding the local conditions and social dynamics. In her report, she describes an organizational hierarchy determined by the authority and superiority of the white hunter over the locals, which she describes as primitive as the first human. The white leads the team of the 60 local men, which were an important factor of the success of the expedition. Her narrative corresponds to the well-documented colonial paternalistic construction of the other. We know from the museum records that Franz Baumann and Berne de Watteville agreed at a meeting before the expedition in 1922 on displaying the hunting trophies in dioramas of the kind de Watteville had seen in Sweden and Baumann at the Senckenberg Museum in Frankfurt, which he considered as exemplary. Baumann even hired Georg Ruprecht, one of the taxidermists at Senckenberg, to be chiefly responsible for the conception of the African dioramas at the museum in Bern. According to Susanne Köstering, dioramas were rather underrepresented in the German Empire, but they established themselves alongside other presentation media of the 19th century at privately financed institutions which aimed their educational mission at a broad non-academic public. The aim of the representation of nature in dioramas was to educate visitors in biodiversity, the beauty of nature, endangered flora and fauna, nature conservation, and so forth. In case of the Senckenberg Museum, wealthy citizens donated collections or undertook hunting expeditions to hunt down spectacular trophies for the museum. These journeys and donations resulted in several exhibitions of the African animal world in Frankfurt. The German East Africa diorama, as you can see on the left side on the slide, presented an idyllic world of animals in an intact environment. As Köstering points out, the visualization referred to the idea of nature reserve, which hunters, naturalists, and museum officials alike started to get engaged with. So, in the meantime, the dioramas are protected monuments, and according to the museum website of today, the African exhibition is the heart of the museum. The legacy of the de Wattevilles was instrumental in the shaping of the museum as it stands, and therefore the exhibition hall is named after the de Wattevilles. Integrating the specimen in scenographies saw it turn from a mainly scientific institution to a public museum with a popular science approach to its zoological displays. Here now, as I mentioned in the introduction, from a perspective of a representational critique, I will talk about what I concluded from my analysis of the diorama exhibitions, its contextualization by the entrance situation, and the captions the dioramas have been given in the museum. I defined the main challenges posed by the displays as follows. The naturalistic reconstruction signal a realism through which the fictionality of their narratives resides into the background. The displays imply an order of nature which is represented as objective fact and given an eternal and scientific impression through the gravity of the institution. Although in Berne, the tiny introductory panel at the entrance contextualizes the specimens historically as trophies, this stands in juxtaposition to the captions of the dioramas themselves. These attest to the specimens being scientific objects. Informations dating the manufacture of the display is not visible. The exhibited animal has no story of its own. Rather, it is an object shown as representative of its species and interchangeable. The object is thus dehistoricized. Instead of the complete title, Animals of Africa, Gorillas, Lions and Co., we find the abbreviated version Africa in the entrance hall. By leaving away the full version, the title here and the black graphic symbolize the whole continent, creating an impression in which the object of the expedition stand in for the whole of Africa. On the other side of the entrance hall, as you can see, the display associates Africa with adventure and safari. The picture of de Watteville with the yellow cabinet to the left displaying the skull of the last lion that de Watteville killed and in return killed him are contextualized by a text showing recognition of the hunter's achievement, which code the animal specimens as trophies of the African wilderness. The dioramas show an idealized African nature. The continent of Africa is homogenized and reduced to a formerly pristine and timeless deserted wilderness. Important seems to me here that the narrative of Africa is characterized by the absence of active proponents. While de Watteville in particular is portrayed larger than life at the entrance and the hunting expedition is listed as a success story for the town, and the museum, the locals in the photographs, who we know from Vivian de Watteville's account were essential to the venture, remain anonymous and unmentioned as part of this successful shared history. Instead, they are fixed in timeless images. The photographs of the safari group function as a testimony to the expedition and confirm the credibility of de Watteville's as hunters. Interestingly, the only place a local population is mentioned in the exhibition is an intervention from 2012 referring to the global illegal trade of horn. In this panel, the locals are mentioned as a threat to the endangered animals due to poverty, for which development aid is organized to save the endangered species. So what view do you think this produces of the people living on this continent? So hopefully it is becoming clear how the dioramas at the Natural History Museum in Bern are reflected as cultural heritage in terms of their quantity, taxidermist quality and context of origin in commemoration of de Watteville's hunting expedition, without discussing nature as a constructed narrative, or including the viewpoint of the local population, or giving the animal preparations an individual biography. Without further action, the romanticized ideal of nature and racialized imageries of Africa are to be continued, even if this is not the intention of the institution. Since the concept of nature is not reflected as a socially and politically constructed scientific category, this may be a reason why, in contrast to objects classified as cultural artifacts, the context of colonized acquisition and in more general terms, the provenance of natural objects in natural history collections remained largely unquestioned until recently. So, and now to involve you in my own research. 1 year ago, I started to get interested in the provenance of this specific diorama. And I think the Okapi group is in many ways a good example to show the potential of natural history specimens if we activate them as artifacts. So I will just give you a brief insight. The museum had to wait until 1957 to realize the Okapi family display, which has to do with the special status of the Okapis as species. The Okapi, as well known as the forest giraffe, was endemic only to the central and northeastern tropical rainforest of Congo and was very rare. As one of the last large mammals discovered for Western science only in 1901, the Okapi was taken under strong protection by the Belgian authorities. Exceptions for hunting permits were made for scientific research or museum collections. Until the 1930s, the okapi was sent to European zoos as diplomatic gifts for kings, princes, and presidents, and had a highly symbolic, even a political value. Therefore, different infrastructures were installed, such as an okapi capture and breeding station in Congo-Epulu, which existed until the 1960s. Importantly, the local Mputi pygmies knew of the animal long before its Western scientific discovery in 1901. They considered the okapi sacred. It had and still has a spiritual value. Only the chiefs were allowed to wear or sit on okapi skin. Their techniques for capturing okapis and knowledge of rainforest plants served Belgian authorities in establishing the wildlife station. So how did the okapi come to Bern? One of the okapis was sold by the Zoological Garden Basel to the museum in Bern in 1956, originally as a gift from the Belgian government to the zoo. It died just 1 month after its arrival from Belgian Congo in Switzerland. The other 2 okapi specimens resulted from an exchange in order to receive okapi specimens from the Congo Museum in Tervuren. The museum in Bern and its taxidermist prepared various animals, including okapis, for the pavilion of the Congolese fauna for the 1958 World's Fair in Brussels. While the museum had in principle no interest in providing services for other museums, it made an exception because of the rare okapi. It is a coincidence that the taxidermist Georg Ruprecht, who began his career in Frankfurt with okapis, retired in Bern after mounting several okapi exhibits for the World's Fair. So the okapi we can see nowadays in the diorama exhibition in Bern were back in the 60s of great prestige. In order to see if I could find more documents of the cooperation between Tervuren and Bern, the wildlife station in Epulu, I went to see the archives in Brussels. The capture and breeding station of okapi doesn't exist anymore in Epulu. Instead, the Okapi Conservation Project was funded in 1987 at the station in Epulu, and a wildlife reserve was established in 1992 to protect okapis and their habitat. The okapi nowadays features on the logo of the Government Conservation Authority and has been a key attraction to ecotourism. As far as the specimen from World's Fair are concerned, it turns out that the okapi exhibits produced by the Bernese taxidermist in 1957 are currently on display at the new permanent exhibition of the Africa Museum in Tervuren. So just one more information about the okapi concerning the diorama in Bern. I found out that they give a wrong picture of the okapi, the nowadays endangered species. Though the okapi is nearly impossible to observe in the wild, cameras show that okapis are solitary and don't join together in small groups. Today, we don't know if there was a lack of knowledge, an interest in diversity of genders, or the aim to show them as harmonious wildlife family that was responsible for the representation of the okapis as a family group. Because this has often been criticized in the context of habitat dioramas, that they often show an idealized heteronormative family narrative. So what I hope to show with my glimpse into the research on the example of the okapi group in Bern is that such exhibits can be activated as source to examine the colonial patterns in science, presentations in museums and their connections to zoos and nature preservation in our days. It turns the attention towards the questioning how animal specimens can develop different meanings in their scientific, cultural, and political dimensions, their social life of things. And the okapi group is most certainly a product of entangled histories. Provenance research serves as a vital starting point for the critical examination of the museum's collection. The big question is, what position do nature museums want to take in the current debate of decolonization of colonial heritage in collections and on display? Where do they see their responsibilities? And in the case of Bern, is the African nature valued in the perspective of the 1930s or 1960s still adequate for 2021? I think there is a great potential for natural history museums to not only focus on their heritage of nature as scientific fact, but through a critical inquiry and deconstruction of the exotic representations on display, help to further enable critical reading of culture for the audience and the institution. By including other disciplines, institutions, stakeholders, or even activist groups and communities from the places of origin, additional perspectives on the artifacts would create a multi-perspectivity. An essential key is that this process is made visible and accessible for the audience. In such a context, the artifacts on display are no longer silent representatives of a settled history, but fine examples to demonstrate the dynamic complexity of entangled histories, which would help to increase an awareness of Switzerland's colonial and global history. Thank you very much for listening.